Thank you. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about understanding Shakespeare better through characters. And I'm going to kind of carry on a theme that I started off with my book that I released last year. And if I can get my computer working, I can change the slide. There we go. So in it, I was talking about the idea of helping students to understand Shakespeare and the choices that Shakespeare makes by giving them some clear, specific structural choices that Shakespeare could have chosen, and what were the options. And so this is what I'd started with and started sharing with students, and it helped them to explain and to develop their ideas and talking about Shakespeare. So what I'm going to do is going to take that a little bit further, and I'm going to look at this idea. So when we teach Shakespeare, or when we teach literature, these are the components generally: plot, character, language, structure, themes, and the message. And I'm going to look today at character and look at how we can teach character and how we can help students with actually talking about character. So when we talk about character, we can break it down and say that characters are symbols. We can say whether they're major or minor characters. We can say whether they're in the background or the foreground, so we can look at their positioning. We can look at the characterization and so on. And we can look at all these different things to help students to talk about characters. But still we get a number of problems with students talking about characters in any text, regardless of whether it's Shakespeare or not. So when we look at things, so what are the problems that students have with talking about character? Well, often what happens in the stories and when they're writing about it is it's just reduced to the protagonist and antagonist. And for me, as talking about text, it can be helpful to talk about those, but they are largely reductive concepts. You know, what much else can you say about antagonist and protagonist? You know, it's a protagonist and it's the antagonist. And so students get hung up on those phrases and those terms when we're talking about it. So they're either just spotting whether they're goody or baddie. And then we have the problem where students see them as existing as in the real world, that they're real people. So Macbeth is a real person, you know, when they're watching the play and when they're watching Romeo and Juliet, they're real people, and they treat them as if they're real people. And then we also have them seen in binary concepts. So they're either good or evil, and they don't understand the shades of complexity behind. You know, we can have good characters and we can have good characters that do bad things, but we can have bad characters that can do good things. I'm reminded of the poem Vultures, the idea that life is complex. And so we also have things like a lack of understanding that characters are quite fluid, and the nature of characterization, the nature of characters are fluid. You know, that they change, they're constantly changing, they're constantly evolving and constantly becoming different things at different points in the stories. And I think that's quite hard for students, and they struggle with those things. But the other thing as well is that students also have a limited life experience. You know, when we're looking at characters that are parents, you know, hopefully, you know, these children haven't been a parent, so they don't understand actually the complexities of that kind of relationship. So these are the kind of problems that we face when we ask students to write about characters. So if we take that further, so I'm going to use the phrase audience identification. So we're familiar with that because we know how the world around us today uses audience identification. We know that, you know, on a given show, you know, people would be chosen to help, or, you know, identify people in the audience, and they can relate to them. So they know that that's an important thing, and we know that's an important thing. But I don't necessarily think students know that that's a really important thing when it comes to looking at texts. So for example, it's really interesting to think of this because actually the audience for Shakespeare, they were aware of audience identification because, you know, prior to Shakespeare's theatre and just the early time of the Elizabethan age was morality plays. And with the morality play was audience identification. It was a character. They were largely allegorical, and the audience was a part of the story, and hence why we have character, the everyman. And so the story they were watching was a story about them, and it was teaching them about something morally. And so they were aware that they were partly in that story, and they had a role within that story. It was teaching them, and they could see that person in the audio, in the story, and they could relate to them. And there was a clear relationship between the audience and the character. And they knew that, and they could see that because they knew it was teaching. And with a name like Everyman, okay, it's that kind of thing that we've got there, that audience identification. So if we take that further, so for me and my experience of Shakespeare, it's changed over the years. And actually, if I'm honest about it, when I was younger, I identified with Romeo. When I was really, really young, I identified with Romeo. When I got to about university, I was a bit more like Mercutio. And then as I got older, and at the moment, I'm probably in line with Capulet. And I identify more with Capulet, and the experience he's having to go through and the difficulty for him. And and a lot of the time we say that Capulet is a bad character and he's not a nice father, but actually I kind of identify having two young daughters and wanting the best for your daughter, but also the idea that your daughter doesn't see what they want in line with your views. And so you can see that. And so at some stage I'm probably going to end up being like the prince, I doubt it, or more likely to be the friar, some older, wise figure. Okay, so that audience identification, I think, is really important because, for us, we identify with characters in a story and they resonate, they ring true to us. But what is it about that audience identification, and what does Shakespeare do to help with that audience identification? Because at different stages of my life, I identify with different characters. So as an audience member, I can relate to Romeo, I can relate to Mercutio, I can relate to Capulet because I have been those types of people. But what does Shakespeare do? So Shakespeare does these things. So he shows different characters from different viewpoints. So you might have an optimistic character, or you might have a pessimistic character, or he does it physically. So a character is old physically, or life experiences. And so these are the different things that Shakespeare does to kind of help with the audience identification. So you relate. Now we're constantly talking about, why Shakespeare is great and it's about the human condition. Well, I think these are things that make up that human condition. The fact that the life experiences we can relate to. I can relate to Capulet because of his life experiences, and mine might be not the right thing to do at the time, but I can relate to it because I've been in a similar situation. We've also got other things in there, social standing, relationships, power relationships, but also the reactions. Would you react in the same way that that character does? It doesn't matter what the story is, but we can all say, well, yeah, I would act that way. That's how I would behave. Or I wouldn't act like that. Would we be like Romeo? Would we be doing that? In the case with Macbeth, would we have the same reaction if somebody said to us that we were going to be the king, and there was a possibility? Wouldn't we kind of have that thought in there? Okay, hopefully we wouldn't go to the line of killing people, but we'd probably have that feeling, that reaction. And so Shakespeare does this. Shakespeare does this to put it in the story, and they're structured around these things so that different people and they can connect. And we know that in Shakespeare because the characters, we have young and old, and we have big characters in power, characters not. But actually Shakespeare does a lot more, and this is what he does. He gives characters weaknesses. He gives people flaws so we can identify. That's the element of the everyman. We all have flaws. That's what's human about us. That imperfection makes us beautiful, and that's what Shakespeare is drawing attention to. Now, I'm going to take one strand of those, and we're going to look at comedy. And I think comedy is a really, really important thing. Now, comedy is complex. There's so many different routes to comedy. But I think for us, for audience identification, Shakespeare uses comedy. And to prove that point, if I just go to the next slide, if we look at the characters that we have in the story, and I'm going to take Romeo and Juliet for a couple of things I'm talking about, but I will talk about other stories. If we look at the comic characters in Shakespeare's work, and if we look at the comic characters in Romeo and Juliet, for example, we've got lowbrow comedy and we've got highbrow comedy. We've got good old Nurse. She's our lowbrow comedy. She's the one that's making sex jokes, rude innuendos, and all that. And that would appeal to the groundlings and, and to everybody really with that kind of, saucy humor. It's that kind of thing. But then also we've got Mercutio, who is a comic character. But I would say that he actually functions at a different level in terms of his comedy, because he balances between that lowbrow, coarse, rude humor, but also he's got that pun, that more artistic, poetic humor. And I think that's quite an interesting character for identification, because actually what Mercutio does is he grasps two different worlds, the low class and the higher class thing. So actually he can get two different sets of audience. And so comedy there is used quite importantly. And it's interesting with Mercutio, because I would say Mercutio is the story's clown, but he's a clown of both worlds, in two different worlds. He's got two different spheres. And it's interesting that his conversation with the nurse, because you've got two comic characters gravitating towards each other. And if you look at what Shakespeare does, is actually Shakespeare uses comic characters around Romeo and Juliet. And actually, what we'll see in other stories, in Shakespeare's stories, is that those comic characters, we know he had some actors who were very good comedians, but we know that if we have a look at those characters together, if you look at Juliet, and you've got the nurse, and then you've got Romeo, and then you've got Mercutio, and actually what you've got is two innocents, but you've got these comic characters surrounding them. And when you kill off Mercutio in Act 3, what you actually do is you kill the clown, you kill the comedy. And that is a massive shift in terms of the story, in terms of the audience identification, because you kill a part of the audience. Because a lot of us, we love Mercutio, and that's quite a clear structural device that's used to have a big impact, because then you can see what happens to Mercutio, this could happen to Romeo. And so it's interesting what Shakespeare does with audience identification. So if we move it to the next thing. So I'm going to take two characters from Shakespeare's plays. I'm going to talk about Hamlet. I love Hamlet. I probably identify now with Polonius now, sadly. Okay, fingers crossed I don't get stabbed behind a curtain. But Hamlet is a really interesting character, because Hamlet is a comic character all the way through the story. Yes, he's morose. He's like that sad clown. And if we go to Commedia dell'arte, if we go to the Italian comedies, if we look at that, he is that sad clown. He is the sad clown figure. But we've got those comic elements, but also we've got touched by sadness. And we see that, don't we, with comedians. They've got that heavy mix of comedy and drama. But for me, that's the thing that connects me to him, the humor. I love the humor. That's what makes me enjoy Hamlet, the character, the story, and get on, because we're having the laugh. Because what does comedy do? Comedy unites us. Comedy brings us together. Everybody loves having a joke. Everybody likes having a laugh and a silly in-joke. And that's what Hamlet's doing. Hamlet is having that in-joke. Now, Beatrice, another character, I love Beatrice. And it's interesting that what Shakespeare does with Beatrice is Shakespeare makes Beatrice the comedian. And from the start of the play, she is the comedy. She derives the comedy. She's not the victim of the comedy. She stands up and she matches with Benedict's comedy. And I'd say that actually, if we look at how Much Ado About Nothing is structured, it is around Beatrice and looking at her comedy, but also her sad story, and how that comedy can switch off. But that's how we identify with her, and that's how we connect. And that's why I love her. I think she's a fantastic character, Beatrice, but it's the humor touched with the sadness and that sad comic clown. So moving on then. So about the audience identification. So comedy is just one bit, but I think we need to work harder with working with students on helping them to see that audience identification. So I've taken two scenes from a Globe version of Romeo and Juliet. Absolutely love this version, okay? And this version here, and I want us to just think about, what do we identify with? What in these two moments that we could identify with in the story? So if we take that and start thinking about making that explicit with students, because what do you recognize in those two different situations? Do you recognize some part of your life? So do you remember being like that in Romeo and Juliet? Do you remember falling in love with somebody and seeing them for the first time, that first kiss? Do you remember, what was it like? Okay. And on the other side, do you recognize it? Oh, your parents do tell you off? Is your mum standing on the side? That's the nurse here. Do you recognize that kind of situation? Do you understand it? Do you understand what's going on in their minds? Do you know what they're thinking? Do you understand what the father is thinking? Do you understand what Juliet's thinking? And do you understand, interestingly, what the nurse is thinking? And then the final thing I'd say is, do you empathize? So can you, your connection with the story, can you empathize? And this is where it's difficult for students, because I think, we are living in a world at the moment where people aren't showing empathy. And there's a real big problem with empathy. And this is why I think, we talk about, recovery curriculum. I think we have to look at empathy. Empathy is one of the biggest things that we need to work on in society, that empathy and understanding how other people feel. So do you empathize? Because they could probably say, I empathize with, Juliet. She's being told, what is it like? But can we empathize with the father? And interestingly, can we empathize with the nurse? Because that's an interesting relationship in here. So that audience identification, there is lots there that we can talk about. Students can say, yeah, I identify with the nurse in this situation, because it's hard when your dad is telling off your brother and sister, and it's really, really awkward because you don't know what to say, and you kind of know that your dad's wrong, but actually, you don't want to say anything. So it puts that kind of context and understanding and connection with that. So we can take that a little bit further. So in Shakespeare, do we recognize situations? Do we recognize specific people? Do we recognize the dilemma? Do we recognize an emotion? And this is about that connection, because this is the thing. We need to connect students to texts. We know texts are brilliant. We know stories are brilliant, but actually we've got to look at that connection, and actually that emotional connection. Do they understand a dilemma? Do they understand an emotion? Do they empathize with an emotion? Do they empathize with a dilemma? So this is a way that we can kind of help students to build that in, that audience identification. So then we can start using some words and helping. Now, of course, this is AO2. This is all AO2 stuff. This is talking about the effect. And no, at the moment, we haven't looked at any of the language. We've just looked at pictures, but then we can start adding these words into it. And then we can start, well, do we support what the father is doing? Do we respect the father for what he's doing, the character? Do we empathize, or do we pity what's going on? Can we connect? Are we, what do we hope in this situation? And so we're actually talking about what the audience reaction is. And I think that's one of the weakest things when students write about texts. And when they write about Shakespeare, they often just default, well, the Elizabethan audience would think this, and then we get a generic comment. We need to start thinking about the emotion and what kind of things that we can say, and to help those students to kind of empathize and understand the story better. So, for example, pity, really, really interesting word, but students don't use the word pity. Often it's sympathize, which is used incorrectly. Pity is such a really, really strong idea for students to understand. Who do you pity most in the story? Who's got the most pity? Who's got the least pity? And I think it's something that we can kind of build on with students in text. So we've got some more able students, higher prior attainment, and hopefully this is where Key Stage 3 is really, really important, because Key Stage 3 in our curriculum should be showing them a breadth of Shakespeare, so that by the time they get to GCSE, they have been faced with lots of different situations and lots of different scenarios. So for example, here I've taken father relationships because I identify with the dad, because I'm a dad. But you can see here that I've gone for lots of different relationships. And then the key question we can say to students and our more able students is this consistent with Shakespeare's other plays? Is this the same? Is this a trend? Is this a pattern? So when we look at, for example, King Lear, and we look at his relationship with his daughters and his troubled relationship with his daughters, then we look at Shylock in Merchant of Venice and Jessica, and the whole idea that she wants to marry and become a Christian, goes against what he wants. And you can see that we see this pattern, this dilemma again and again in Shakespeare's work. We've got Midsummer Night's Dream. Aegeus and his daughter doesn't want to marry the person he wants her to marry. And so you can see that fathers controlling their daughters is a common thing. We have it in Much Ado About Nothing. The shame that the inky black spot of sexual liaison causes the father in Much Ado About Nothing. And then we've got an unruly daughter in Taming of the Shrew. So we see that story, and I can identify with these stories because there's a father in them, and there's a father who's having difficulty with his daughters, his understanding of his daughters doing what he thinks is best. And of course, we've got loads of issues there in terms of the story. Is it right? Is it wrong? Is it, what the father is asking to do? All those sorts of things are there in the story. So I think we need to get students to be doing this, but first they need to have that audience identification. And then they can say things, well, it's common in Shakespeare's work to see fathers struggling to control. It's common, it's a trope in Shakespeare's plays to show fathers losing power. Usually we see fathers in Shakespeare's plays telling off their daughters. It's a common thing, and it's always a shock when we show Much Ado About Nothing when the father slaps. It's horrendous, it's shocking, but the audience, it's that understanding he's gone too far, and that's that connection and that identification with things. So taking it further, so we can go further with this, with the audience identification, because there's another strand. Because, right, okay, let's connect to the text, but also we can then start thinking, is this a universal experience? Is it something that, look, people in Shakespeare's time were experiencing this? I experienced that yesterday with my dad. It's the same thing. The fathers are just the same in Shakespeare's time as they are now. Or is it an Elizabethan thing? And is the issue that we've got? So, for example, Capulet's behavior towards Juliet is born out, is his fear of having a daughter that's unmarried. That is a genuine concern for Elizabethan fathers, and the embarrassment, the shame surrounding having a daughter that's not married, and the repercussions of that. But then also we can then think about, well, are we looking at in a contemporary point of view? Are we looking at this from a contemporary aspect, a modern angle? Do we see this differently to the way that, the Elizabethans? And if we look at this in particular, we look at the marriage thing, don't we? The marriage thing is the difference today, that we allow daughters to have a choice in who they marry. And so that's why today, this context, looking at Capulet telling off his daughter and him forcing her to marry, we're uncomfortable because we put the individual having a choice in terms of marrying. So you can see how we can build those layers up for us. So other stories, and there are other stories out there, and I think it's really important to look at the audience identification. So Macbeth, okay, there is comedy in there. It's not as much comedy, and of course, the identification with Macbeth is really about Macbeth himself and this weak character. But I think what's interesting, and we go back to the Globe version of the play itself, is it's interesting that Banquo is very much played as a comic character. And I think that's quite interesting because I've never really thought of Banquo as largely a comic character. And we're not saying a comedian, we're saying there are comic elements and he has little jokes and things like that. And I think it's quite interesting that in Act 3, he dies, which is exactly the same with Romeo and Juliet. Kill the clown, kill the comic element, and it gets sadder and sadder. And an interesting thing about, the porter, there is a clear comic device. And there, you can see how Shakespeare is using comedy in his stories. So just to kind of finish off, I think this audience identification is a key thing, because talking about two things, and I've put some blogs about how I've explored this in other ways. But I think Christmas Carol is really important for audience identification. I will say this to students. I think Scrooge is the most funniest character ever. I think he's hilarious. I can't stop laughing at the opening. And I think that is a pure device by Shakespeare to make us like him. You know, and I think that's the interesting, not Shakespeare, sorry, Dickens. Dickens is trying to make us like the character. And, you know, that's how he's making our key character appealing. Even though he's horrible and mean and horrible, he tells jokes. And so that's how we connect. We connect with Scrooge because of the comedy. But it's interesting, if you have a look at J.B. Priestley's Inspector Calls, I think that works with that audience identification to the complete opposite. And I'd say that this is also part of to do with part of what was going on at the time with political theatre and drama and Brecht and naturalistic theatre, is that in an Inspector Calls, all the characters are repulsive. They are repulsive to start off with. And what Priestley does is he changes that so we start liking. So we go from the opposite in terms of let's try and build connections. We actually get Priestley trying to distance ourselves and alienate ourselves from these characters. And it's actually, you know, the morality of Sheila that turns things around in the story for us, because it's Sheila and it's Sheila's humanity that turns the story around. They're all repulsive. They're all arrogant. They've all got flaws. They've got problems, but there's no audience identification. And I say that is purposely what Priestley is doing. He wants us to dislike these characters because it's the turning point in Sheila. The turning point in Sheila, and also later on Eric, that makes us identify with these characters. When Sheila starts feeling sorry, that's when we identify with her. And there is a switch. And that's quite a subtle thing for students to really grasp their eyes on, because really, you know, we're alienating all the way through the story until we get to that point. And so there's two blogs that I've written about it loosely, but not directly linking to today's talk, of course. So what can we do? What can we do to help students write better about character? Well, I think we need to define what connects the audience to events on stage. It's not enough to do tension graphs. It's not enough to just colour in a little chart and things like that. I think we have to state what is the connection, and we have to talk about the connection, and we can't have nebulous words like, oh, it's, you know, creates a creepy atmosphere, it's a, you know, a doom filled atmosphere. I think we have to say, what is the connection? I identify with this character. So Mark and Matt were talking about Romeo and Juliet, and they were talking about the rude jokes. Okay, well, that is one way of audience identification. Rude jokes, humor. It's that lowbrow humor that gets people laughing, funny. We all like a bit of a rude joke every so often. Well, most of us do anyway. So that's what we've got to start thinking about. We've got to explore how comedy is used to build a connection, which in particular, the death of the clown, exploring the use of the everyman concept. You know, who is meant to be the person in the audience? And also we've got to remember that there are life experience gaps. You know, students at 15 haven't had that much experience of life. And so we've got to help them build that empathy with that. And I'm just going to finish off by just saying, if there's anything you want to ask, any questions, anything, or even if you want to go, I disagree, Chris, that was rubbish, feel free to message me on Twitter. I'm more than happy to respond. And there's my blog there as well. Thank you.
Massive thank you, Chris. The Twitter is going crazy, quite honestly, with comments and questions for you. Again, guys, please just keep using that hashtag TENConline. There's some amazing chats going on.